Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our GIA CPD event on Research and Development Tax Relief. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to run over a couple of house rules before we begin. First of all, please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation, just to avoid any disruptions. If you've got any questions, if you stick them into the chat box below, we can go through all the questions at the end. And the event will be recorded and it will be available on the GIA website. So I'll introduce our speaker. We're joined by Karen McFadden, who is the Associate Director of CATAX. And Karen, if you're ready, please take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, guys. Hi to everybody on board today. Yep, I'm basically going to be talking to you about some tax relief initiatives available to the architect sector. Now, I just said to the guys there, it's about getting tax back as opposed to paying it. So hopefully it should be a relatively interesting conversation to listen to. But I'll just share my screen and take it from there. So this is where it gets too technical for me. Perfect. Victoria, can you just let me know if that's coming through okay?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Superb. Okay. So basically, ultimately, yes, I'm going to be talking about R&D tax relief as the main concept to this conversation, but I'll also touch upon a couple of other tax initiatives that might be applicable to you personally or some of your clients. Reason I'm doing this talk today is because I do find that there's quite a lot of architect practices that are completely familiar with this concept. They claim for it every year and they know everything to do. And then there's the opposite, where they have no idea what it is. They don't know anything about the legislation. They don't know if it applies to them. They've possibly heard of it before, but it's just not relevant, to their gig. So I just thought it would be a good idea to come on, go through a few examples of where we find R&D, what the initiative exactly is, and also I'm going to touch upon a bit on misconceptions of claiming, because I think that's really important. I've heard a few worries in the past, and then I'll go into just a few case studies as well. Now, I'm hopefully going to make this as sort of picturesque as possible for you, because I'll try and maybe get my cell phone camera here just so, yeah, there we go. I'll try and make it as picturesque as possible for you, because I know that tax relief in general is not an exciting topic, but this is basically an initiative from HMRC, and it's been designed to reward limited companies in the UK. So it's not just architect practices, it's limited businesses. Now, if there are any LLPs that are joining today, the only way you would be applicable to apply for this would be if you'd done a project and within the project there was a partner who was a limited company. Very few and far between, so if you are an LLP and that doesn't apply to you, this next half hour might not be that interesting. Now, the good thing about this tax relief is you can go back 2 full tax years. So my advice is, if you do have an April or a May year end coming up, then definitely look into this, because you don't want that year end to finish and then you've kissed goodbye to a whole year's worth of claiming before. So what exactly is it? HMRC define R&D as you have to be either finding, using or creating an advance in the field of science or technology. Now, that could sound like you have to build a rocket ship. It can sound quite heavy. And actually, R&D is just not black and white. It's completely grey. It can be very obvious to one practice and then not so obvious to the other. So I tend to explain to my clients that innovation comes in 3 different forms. So the first form is new product development. Now, this is pretty standard. Obviously, if you're bringing a new product to the market, of course, it's going to be the first of its kind. It's going to be something that obviously hadn't existed before, so you're now creating it. Along with that, you're going to have natural uncertainties in the design process. You're going to have conversations around, I'm not 100% sure if this will work, but let's give it a bash. And there's got to be experimental phases as you're going through the design, and build of it. So R&D is pretty obvious when it comes to new product development. The second area is advancing something that already exists. So this is ultimately when you look at your sector and you understand, okay, what's the limit of my sector right now? What's the benchmark? What does the sector offer me as a solution to this right now? And how can I push past that? How can I actually take it to the next level? Now, the next slide that I go into will go into far more detail on R&D projects, particularly in your field. But in general, when you're advancing something that already exists, ultimately, in your field, you've got clients coming to you all the time wanting things bigger, better, stronger, more advanced. And sometimes you can look at your market and go, okay, well, this is where we are right now. This is the options we could use, but the clients want more. The client wants more, or the client wants better. So we have to go above and beyond. Now, this is typically where you look at, say, off-the-shelf solutions, and they're just not suitable. So you have to use, a wee bit of thinking. And you'll also be having conversations around, okay, we're not quite sure exactly what we can do here. We might have to, really kind of think outside the box. And that's what brings me on to the third area. Now, process innovation is actually hugely missed by the construction and the architect sector, because this area of R&D is all about problem solving. And the most common misconception I hear from guys in your sector is that problem solving is just your day-to-day job. It's what you get paid for. And you're completely correct. But HMRC do completely understand that within problem solving, there could be trade secrets that you don't share with a competitor. They're completely aware that two architect practices have got a client who want them to build a house. So building a house isn't, brand new, it's not a new concept. Both the houses will look the same, both the houses will have the same height, the same amount of bedrooms, but actually behind the scenes, the process and how you've developed the design for that house may be completely different. For example, client A might have a budget of £1 million and client B might have a budget of 200,000, and you'd have to develop a house. So, there's going to be moments where you'll look at the rule book and the rule book doesn't actually tell you exactly what to do. There will be moments where you've got projects where what's on paper in the office might not actually be able to take place as a solution once you're on site for a million different reasons. And, these are typically moments where you and the team sit together and go, well, we can't do that because of the foundations. We can't use this when we typically would have used it in the past because of the land conditions. Typically, we would have used this avenue, but because of the structure of the building, we can't actually make sure that that's going to be structurally sound. So how do we get around that? And as long as these conversations have some element of uncertainty and some element of this is where we would like to get to, whether we can get there or not is a different story. So let's try and put some processes in place. Let's try some new methods. As long as you're having chats like that, and it's not as easy as just, okay, the client wants this done, I'll open a book and the book will tell me what to do, and within 2 weeks I'll get it done. As long as it's not as simple and straightforward as that, then definitely there's concept there to have a chat about R&D. Now, I'm not going to go through every single part that I've highlighted on this slide, but I just wanted to sort of share that when I speak to architect practices and construction, because there's a lot of crossover, like I said, the whole concept here is clients want you to do things that are completely, out of your control, totally bizarre scenarios. They want you to develop really cool, buildings. And sometimes it can be straightforward. Sometimes you can use a copy and paste model and apply that thinking and it works out perfect. And then other times, I reckon you're just lost for thought. So I do find that in your sector, you are leading edge on, low carbon and sustainable architectural design builds. You are always thinking about environmental policies and ecological policies and how you can merge them. And typically, when you look at the last 2 years of business with, the last 2 years worth of projects, I guarantee there'll be moments where you've talked about, here, non-standard materials. So where you've looked at a job and you've thought, well, usually we would take this avenue, but on this particular concept, we can't. So what have you done then? When you think of your projects as well, if you're using words like improving, advancing, maximising, pushing boundaries, above and beyond, outside the box, if you're talking like that, then surely there's got to be something unconventional that you're thinking of doing, or something against the norm or against the rule book. And you'll be doing it for a reason. You'll be doing it to like I say, improve efficiency, improve the sustainability of the building, improve the airflow, the heating, the facades. There will be a reason why you're trying to think outside the box. And typically when you're actually trying to implement these changes, that's where R&D takes place, because in R&D, the question will always come back to how difficult was it? And that's really what revenue and customs are interested in. They're not so much interested in the fact that you've developed this really cool house and it sings and dances and does everything else. They're really interested in how did you actually get to that stage where all of these problems you faced, how did you actually overcome them? Did you use off-the-shelf solutions, or did you have to use your brain and your team and your resources and come up with new ways? Bringing new knowledge to the field is a really interesting concept for architects, because many of my clients, they come across particular sectors or particular avenues, and they find that there's a very limited knowledge in the atmosphere. They find that there's very limited resources out there for them to go to and actually use and improve on. So I actually have quite a few clients that go around universities and they've created transcripts, or they've created modules or certificates, and they're doing this to share knowledge and also to expand on it and bring new knowledge to the market. And that's nothing to do with new product development. That is literally coming across a gap in the market, filling that gap, writing about it, and then even publishing it into a book. That was one of my particular clients. So bringing new knowledge to the field is a very interesting concept too. When I come down here to improving circular economy, improving modular build projects, something revenue and customs love is reduced waste. Okay, anything you can do in your project to improve waste being sent to landfill, recycling, upcycling, using recycled materials within projects, they love it, because it typically comes with challenges. It doesn't tend to be that it's just as simple as saying, oh, right, okay, well, I've made a building today, and in 25 years' time, we could take that building apart brick by brick and reuse every part of it. As much as that concept sounds great, it may not be easy to actually carry out, given everything that has to go in the building. So, this is, again, really, really interesting topics to HMRC. Prototype development, natural with new product development. This is where perhaps you come across a project, you're working on it, maybe halfway through it or 3/4 of the way through, you realise that the tooling and machinery, equipment that's available on, maybe on site or off the shelf isn't quite doing exactly what you need it to do. And there might be specific, specific tools or pieces of machinery that you have to get bespoke made. And that's, that can be a very interesting conversation. BREEAM projects, natural innovation, you really have to be pushing the boundary there. That's natural R&D. Work on listed buildings is a massive topic as well, because again, this comes down to process innovation, where you're limited to what you can do with a listed building, and you might also be further limited to the client's budget. Yet you still have to get the house to perform the way it's supposed to perform. So again, it comes back to what are the challenges that you faced there? What were the moments or the sticking points in the project where you got to where you thought, I'm out of ideas, or I really need to sit with my team here and figure out a structure that we can follow to make sure we can test if this process is working. That's interesting. Passive house and paragraph 55 developments. In fact, one of the case studies that I'll be talking about is a passive house example. But of course, R&D all over these concepts. On-site versus off-site process adaptations. So again, this is very popular in construction where, like I say, what you've drawn and what the computer has designed for you is great on paper, but does it actually work on site? And when it comes to possibly having materials or equipment designed, again, when you design it on a small scale, does it have the same impact when you design it on a large scale, off-site? So this is definitely an area where I've found a lot of process innovation. And I've mentioned just there, conventional approach is unavailable. So kind of what I've been preaching this whole time, where the book doesn't tell you how to do it. You can't type into Google and it gives you an A to Z list of instructions. You've sat with your team and you've now come up with the conclusion that there's no obvious scenario. So you're going to have to trial and test here. You're going to have to experiment. And that's, certainly R&D all over it. So I want you to just sort of start thinking about your projects over the last couple of years. My best advice here is every practice will be a case by case. What may be considered R&D with one practice might not be considered with another, just down to the methodologies that they've used. But what I really want you thinking is come back to that question on how difficult was it to overcome, and what did the market offer you as a solution at that point, and did you just use that solution? Have a think about that stuff. Now, the bottom point I thought was interesting to mention, improved advanced uses of cross-laminate timber. Now, as much as this is recognised in the architect world and the construction world, there are actually a number of issues with the use of CLT. So first of all, my point before on lack of information in the domain. So if there's not really that much resources out there or information or tried and tested methods that you can just copy and paste, well, actually using this and implementing it into your project could be quite experimental. It might not work. The difficulty in designing a robust solution off-site. Again, mentioned that before, differences with on-site versus off-site. Will it still work? Applying a very experimental technology into modern mainstream applications. So it could be actually this is quite an advanced methodology, and you've got maybe a listed building or an old house that might not work. So bringing old with new, how difficult is that? And again, you've got ever-changing building control regulations. So, this sort of comes back to the limitations that you have in your sector, and depending on the type of build, depending on the property, depending on the local restrictions, the standard solution might just not be available for you to take. So you might have to think outside the box. Now, I just wanted to let you know, actually, just to interrupt myself, I can't actually see if there's any questions coming in. So if there are, I'll get them at the end, but just type them in and we can get to them then. So I wanted just to briefly mention about REBA, because obviously REBA are a massive platform and they do talk about R&D tax relief. They want architects to be claiming, but they have sent out a 27-page document about the topic. Now, if this is your first time claiming or you've never heard of this concept before, reading 27 pages on it, it could put me to sleep, and I do this every single day. So I've highlighted a couple of areas that they talk about within this document, but actually the main message that they actually have there, and I've copy and pasted this from the guidebook, is they want you to seek help. They want you to talk to a specialist, because this is something that you absolutely should learn about. It may be that possibly you haven't been applicable for it before, but the projects you're doing now, absolutely in the bag. So it's just to get yourself acquainted with it. And they have said at the bottom here, consult relevant professional bodies, for example, an R&D tax credit specialist. Now, when I come on to misconceptions, which is next, I didn't actually remember that, I'll talk a wee bit about a question that I get asked quite a lot, which is, shouldn't my accountant just do this? Or why hasn't my accountant just done this for me? So I'll talk through a couple of misconceptions here. So the first one is, solving problems is my day-to-day job, so I don't qualify. You're absolutely correct. You as an architect, as a designer, you get paid to design awesome solutions for clients. That's completely correct. But don't dismiss that your work, your resources, your expenditure, your salary, your subcontractors you work with, don't exclude that, because that could be eligible for an R&D claim. So yes, it is your day-to-day job, but actually your day-to-day job could qualify you for some tax relief. Some of my projects failed, so they don't count. Again, the whole concept of research and development is that there's got to be natural uncertainty. So revenue and customs actually realise if you've tried to be innovative, if you can showcase that you've tried that, i.e. there's been some expenditure put towards it, there's been some resources put towards it, then just because it didn't work out, it's not like they don't pay on it. They still recognise that you tried to do R&D, and they will allow you to claim some of those costs back. So don't get rid of them. Not sure if you can see this properly at the side there. I use off-the-shelf solutions as a base. Now, if you buy a kettle and you use that kettle to boil water, that's essentially the purpose of you buying the kettle. You've bought it for a purpose, it's worked as it was intended to work, and there's no R&D there. However, if you buy an off-the-shelf solution, but you're buying it because it's the next best option, it's what the industry offers you right now, but you have to make adaptations to it, you have to tweak it, you might have to merge it with other technology that's not been done before. You might have to get an engineer in to advance it or adapt it somehow to make it more efficient, more effective, whatever it may be. That is considered interesting for R&D, because essentially HMRC say there, well, if you have to make all these changes, surely there isn't a machine that exists that you could just go buy then. If you've had to make all these changes, then that shows us that you've had to move forward, you've had to advance what industry offers you already. So don't rule it out, even if you do purchase things like that. The most important one, accountants, it's their job, and they told me I don't qualify. CATAX work very closely with accountants because they do have your best interests at heart, and they do, well, any accountant worth their salt will want the best for their client. However, accountants are not paid by you to look at every single area of funding, every single area of finance, of tax, of relief. They just don't, they're not qualified to look after every single sector. Just like, you would go to your GP, and your GP, even though they're a doctor, would refer you on to a specialist if you've, got a tumour in your leg or whatever. So, they're not going to be able to bring this information to your attention, which sometimes means you can miss out. But also, I have been told that, a lot of accountants tell their clients, oh, my accountant told me I don't qualify. Again, one of the examples I'll go into next was that. But my best advice here is speak to a specialist about this topic, because if it's taken you joining this conversation to learn about R&D tax relief, and it's not been brought to your attention by your accountant, it does tell me that this just isn't their remit. So they shouldn't have a problem with you working with a specialist. They should want the best value for you if it's not something they focus on. I've had funding I can't claim. Again, a lot of mismanaged information where clients have been told, oh, you actually got funding, for that through Scottish Enterprise or whatever it may be, so you can't claim. It's total nonsense. You can still put a claim in. It just means you won't get as generous a payout as someone who didn't have funding. So you can still put something in. And finally, I'm a loss-making practice. I don't qualify. Again, a lot of accountants tell clients that this initiative is all to do with corporation tax. And if you're not paying any corporation tax, well, you can't get any benefit. Again, it's misinformation. Ultimately, if you're not paying corporation tax because you're not in profit, well, there's nothing we can reduce there. So instead, you get a cash lump sum. And the cash lump sum is at a lesser percentage than if you were due to pay corporation tax. So kind of similar to the funding, you can still put a claim in, it's just not going to be as generous. So I'll just pop this down a little bit here so you can see this case study. Not going to talk through every single part of this case study, but this was actually from a talk that I'd done on this topic a year ago in May, and Mattis and Associates from the Isle of Wight joined it. Had no idea about R&D tax relief, was very new to it, but as I explained the concept, one of the projects that we actually talked through was titled Thunderbird Meets James Bond. So I straight off the bat knew there was going to be some interesting, intricate problems that she would have faced with that title. I will happily send these around afterwards, but you can have a nosy through it at the moment. Ultimately, there was challenges here based on the geography of being on the Isle of Wight. It's considered one of the areas of outstanding natural beauty. So any design concepts that go on land have to follow a real strict set of guidelines. There's their projects in general. I think we submitted there was about 8 projects that we actually talked upon, and all of them were designed and developed with novel methods, applications of materials in unique ways. And down there in the middle is sort of explaining a wee bit about some of the projects that she worked on. So sustainability was a big focus, reusable recycled materials was a big focus, geological stability was a big focus, using unique properties in projects was a big focus, and ultimately, it was a very successful claim, and this was a fantastic testimonial that she left for us. So I'll give you maybe 30 seconds or so just to maybe screen through that. But it was that was sort of one of my most enjoyable claims to do, because it was something that was completely brand new to her. And the practice was only, I think there was really only about four or five staff in total. So you don't have to be a massive company, you just have to be doing the right things. So I'll give you a few more seconds just to have a nosy through that. So if you haven't read all of that, don't worry about it. I'll be passing the slides over to Victoria and she can share. But the next case study was John Gilbert Architects. This was a passive house example. The client was on a budget, and they had to basically go through ways to develop they had to go through ways to come up with behind the scenes processes that could make the house passive house to the client's budget, but also they were developing a few methods internally that could help them on other projects. So it was all about improving energy efficiency of the building. There had to be a lot of design outlays. There was new processes. There was unique approaches to the experimental phases in the project. So again, the real key point here is just the uncertainty that what they wanted to happen would actually come out the other end. There was a long, I think it was a 3-year period of ups and downs, highs and lows, trials and errors, and then finally they've got what they want to get. And now that they have a solution, they can now take that solution and copy and paste it. So moving forward, that won't be considered R&D anymore because they've found something that works. But the build up to finding that solution, that's where the R&D sits. Just a final architect case study. This was more residential and commercial modular builds. So sort of what I was saying before, we're reducing waste, making improvements to the building, improving the efficiency of the layouts, making sure that the weight of the products and materials being used were displaced properly. I think after Grenfell, there's a huge amount of emphasis on making sure that buildings perform the way they're supposed to. So I think one of the key ones here was a modular build. It was an increased fire rating from 1 hour to 2 hours. And essentially, the client sought to use less material, tick, to ensure the units are lightweight, tick, whilst improving acoustic performance, thermal performance, and fire rating, tick, tick, tick. So these are all areas that they were pushing the boundaries with, and it's stuff that we can go to HMRC with and say, look at what this client's done. So that's me sort of finished on R&D. I know that's quite a lot of information to take in, just off the bat, but I thought it would be quite interesting just to briefly talk about 2 other concepts, because I always find that in your line of work, even if this doesn't apply to you directly, if you can tell your client about it, it just kind of solidifies, the extra knowledge that you guys have. And, it does kind of add that extra layer of confidence with, explaining to your client, listen, have you heard of this or have you heard of that? Because it could maybe help you out. So one of the ones, very, very briefly, it's for contaminated land. So the long and short of this is if you are, I'll just hide this again. If you are, over the last couple of years, or if you have spent money cleaning contaminated land or buildings, like removing asbestos from a building, for example, again, you can claim some tax relief on it. Now, like everything, there's a checklist, to this also, but, the long and short of it is, if your clients are working on complex build problems, and there are contaminants in the ground that they have to remove before you can start your work, then absolutely bring this to their attention, because here is an example of a property development firm. They took on an old fire station. It turned out that they spent almost £250,000 just removing sort of lead paint, contaminated soil. There was asbestos in there as well. There was diesel from underground tanks. There was a whole load of things that was actually there, and they had no idea about this tax initiative. CATAX came along, got them over 50k back, so they were pretty happy with that. And the final one that I'll bring your attention to is called Capital Allowances Tax Relief. Now, this could actually be applicable to yourself or your client. It's all to do with owning a commercial property. Now, the long and short of this initiative is it's designed to reduce your corporation tax bill annually. So really, you want to be in a profitable position if you're looking at making a claim here. But the really easy way to figure out what it's all about is take your building, tip it upside down and shake it. Everything that falls out of that building is typically things that your landlord, sorry, not your landlord, your accountant would qualify for. So they would, get tax relief for your tables, your chairs, your TVs, your pencils, pens, everything that falls out of that building. But the stuff that sticks in the building, the stuff that is embedded into the floors, into the walls, the ceiling, those are the things that typically make your building function. And those are the things that a specialist would come in and get you extra tax relief on. So those are things like your HVAC systems, your radiators, your pipes, your plumbing, your HVAC systems, your CCTV, your kitchenette units, stuff that's stuck there. Now, I won't go into any more detail on that, because really and truly this isn't what the purpose of today was about. But I just thought it was really interesting. If you own a commercial build yourself, you don't have to own it through a limited company. You can own it through an LLP, through a partnership, through your own name. The only one that's void is if you own it through a pension. You can't claim this. But yeah, I just think it's really interesting to perhaps pass on to clients or consider yourself. So that is me. I sort of wanted to keep this to a half-hour slot and give some time for questions. I could talk all day on tax relief because there's so many different stories that I hear, so many questions that I get asked. Normally when I'm speaking with a client and they come up with, the projects and we talk through them, we actually find that there's some, elements that have been missed out, or, they haven't realised as they're talking. They'll just explain maybe what happened on a project, and then it's us that jump in and say, well, how did you manage to merge that, or how did that work out after you implemented this, or whatever it may be. So again, my advice is talk to a specialist. Don't rule this out if you don't know much about it, because it is money sitting there and it's money that you're entitled to claim. Just claim it the right way.
Thanks very much for that, Karen. If anybody has got any questions, if you just pop them into the chat box, we can get through them. I'll maybe start off, Karen, just picking up on one of the points where you'd highlighted potential issues with using CLT. Am I right in assuming that the potential issues there are what you could therefore claim as an R&D tax relief, because it's not as tried and tested in the construction industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So that sort of comes down to experimenting. When something hasn't been tried and tested 100,000 times, and when there's not, common knowledge on it that any and every construction person or any architect would know all about it, that's where you have conversations around, right, this exists, but actually implementing it into this particular building, how do we do that? the fact that you're actually questioning how do you do things, that's where the R&D comes into it. And then obviously once you and your team then come up with that, right, let's try this, the fact that you're trying it tells us that you're not 100% sure that you guarantee this is going to work. It's, you know, something that you're going off on your experience, your knowledge, maybe past projects, and, you know, sometimes turns out that it doesn't work, so you have to approach it from a different angle.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we've not got any questions in the chat box just now. Am I right in saying, Karen, though, that you're happy for anybody who does have any questions to contact you with the email address that came up? Was it inquiries@CATAX Group?
We'll just leave it even my own email, so it was karen.mcfadden@catax.com. But what I'll do, Victoria, I'll pass this presentation over to you, and you can share it with the attendees. Just, you know, no one's asking the question, but, you know, I'll be very honest, a lot of people ask things like, how much am I going to get back? We can never tell how much you're going to get back based on the first conversation, because essentially what we do is we look at your projects, and then we look at your accounts, and we basically try and scrape as much expenditure as possible from those accounts. And then there's calculations that are done based on if your profit loss, funding, etc. But the sort of rule of thumb is, I would typically say that once we figure out what your R&D spend is in total, including all your salaries and all your subcontractor costs and everything else, the client, if they are an SME, then they typically get between 20 to 30% of that total number back. So obviously, if we figure out that you've spent £100,000 on R&D projects, well, there's 20 to 30k there sitting that you're entitled to claim. And in case anyone's wondering how CATAX actually get paid, we work on a contingency basis. I say the word contingency, you guys would say no win, no fee. It's a professional word for the cheesy terminology, but we basically don't get a cut unless you get paid. And typically that will be at the very end once you actually receive your money. So there's no loss. And we also, again, if this is the first time you've ever looked into this sector, you know, certainly have a conversation with your accountant on the topic in general. But again, I would say get, you know, a couple of opinions to make sure that you're not just taking one and that's that. But what I would suggest is to, you know, have a chat with a specialist and just have an open conversation about your projects, because there's probably things that you have done that you wouldn't have necessarily thought was R&D, but by having a conversation with the likes of us, we look at it from different angles. So we actually approach it from a HMRC perspective to make sure that, listen, don't leave that out because you spent 12 grand with a subcontractor on that. So, you know, let's get a portion of that back.
We've just got a question in there, Karen, from Gordon Brown. He said, very, very helpful, thank you. If you can send it on, that would be great, which we can do, and also the recording will be on the GIA website. He said, I'm self-employed but working on a COVID-related innovation with a designer. I'm working zero fee, but the designer has invested maybe 50k so far, so this will be useful for him. If and when I get paid, do I get any relief?
So thank you for the question. When you're self-employed, obviously, if you're not registered as a limited company, then you personally won't be eligible to claim. Certainly though, when you're working with a designer, I assume you have been a subcontractor to him, and this is me, you know, assuming that he's a limited company also. So the fact that he's paid you for this work, then great, that's a cost that we can look at for his company. Something I haven't actually mentioned, and this is something that's very popular amongst my clients, is we have an introducer program. So typically what happens is once a client gets their money back, they actually go, do you know what, I had no idea about this. I know plenty of companies around me in my network that can benefit from this as well. They've passed them on, and there is an introducer fee to get. So Gordon, certainly reach out to me afterwards, because both of you can benefit from you know, introducing myself.
We've got another question as well. Gordon says thank you for that. Another question from another Gordon. What are the risks of tax legislation changing and claimants becoming liable in the future? for full costs including fee, in the same way the EBT scheme was seen as tax avoidance rather than evasion some years back?
So can't obviously tell what will happen in the future, but my advice, as I've been saying this whole way through, is to work with a specialist. I have noticed since the lockdown that apparently every man and his dog can now do tax relief claims. And unfortunately, you do need to go through a due diligence process to ensure that you're not overclaiming for something. Also to ensure you're not putting claims in that actually don't meet the qualifying criteria. So the way that CATAX work to ensure that we tick all the boxes is we would initially have a conversation with a client, take some basics on the project, then have a further deeper in-depth conversation behind the scenes where a tax analyst would hit it at different approaches. It then behind the scene goes through 3 different specialists to ensure that nothing's been overlooked or overclaimed. And the person who signs off the report before it goes to HMRC is a chartered tax accountant by trade. And he's been with CATAX for, I think it's about 6 years now, but he's been in the R&D space for about 14 years. So nothing actually gets submitted to HMRC without his say-so. And again, to give you a bit of an insight to a specialist world, if we deliberately put through a claim that we know is fraudulent or we know has a risk, it will flag up not only the company, but also CATAX. And we submit as a company about 200 claims a month. So we certainly don't want our name being highlighted 200 times to HMRC every time we put something in. So it's certainly within our best interest to make sure what we submit is completely justified and legitimate. That's certainly our ethos, and that's what I would advise you work with whoever you pick as your provider, because you don't want, say, a one-man band who's just picked this up, and goes for it. I would advise you go for a sort of respected player in the field to make sure you don't miss anything out.
Just a little follow-up there from Gordon. He said, many thanks, Karen. My concern is caused by the number of approaches from specialist tax consultants, and a quick bit of research often reveals that they've only been in business for 12 months.
Yeah, well done on you doing research straight away, because there's, like you say, like I said, every man and his dog, apparently knows how to do this. And you are right, it turns out to be possibly someone that has worked for an R&D company in the past, has then set up their own practice. They've maybe got, a few connections that they work with. But, again, do your homework, make the right connections. You will be approached, unfortunately, because apparently, when I said the word contingency and you would use no win, no fee, there's a kind of misconception that the whole PPI thing is sort of like R&D, where everybody approaches you, etc. But I suppose the only thing I can advise is, yes, do your homework. You're obviously doing the right thing so far by joining, sessions like this. The best, also what I would advise is, this is down to the timing of your year end. So unless you do have a year end coming up soon, don't let a company pressurise you into submitting something, because you may have time, and the worst thing you could do is rush this when you don't need to rush it and submit something that actually possibly you've underclaimed for, or worse, overclaimed. So yeah, you're doing the right thing, Gordon, but certainly, connect with me afterwards, and it's good just to keep in touch, keep engaged.
And he said, many thanks.
Perfect. I'm trying to think if there's any extra things that the clients like to hear about. I'll mention a little bit on the first Gordon. Let's scroll back up. Gordon Brown's comment on COVID-related innovation. Something I would actually mention out loud is, somewhere somebody wrote that if you make your business COVID friendly, then that's considered R&D. I wouldn't say that it's complete nonsense, but it always comes back to, are you buying things that exist in the thousands? And are you using those things for the intended purpose you bought them for? And if you are, well, you've not done R&D. The company who developed that product has done R&D, but you using it, it's just you being a consumer. So when it comes to making buildings more COVID friendly or making products more COVID friendly, This will be something that will absolutely be scrutinised by HMRC, because they are aware that these one-man bands are putting forward claims that really just, do not tick the box. So.
We've just got another question in from Graham Nichols. Is there a way to use this as an opportunity to develop work for the practice, i.e. a well-informed client could initiate a research project and commission us to do the work with the knowledge they would receive so much back at the back end, as opposed to us ring-fencing part of the ongoing project or doing something self-initiated? What's the mechanism for the claim the client would claim for R&D expenditure, or we claim for the work done in the practice, or both?
Again, with it being a case by case, the best case scenario there would be that both of you can actually claim. When we look at projects, we tend to look at, first of all, if there's obvious IP involved, and it's really who the IP sits with. That would be the person that would do the main claim. If there's not discussions on IP and it is a collaborative approach, what we would essentially do is understand, okay, where does the cost risk fall? I.e., if this client comes to you and says, right, Graham, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and you say, okay, pay me the 10 grand and I'll do the X, Y, and Z. If you get halfway through that process and you realise that you can't actually do X, Y, and Z, do you then give that money back? Or have you kept that because you've tried to innovate? Those kind of questions are stuff that we look at, and we want to make sure, okay, who's actually taking the financial risk here? But it could be that what you're offering the client is, practices and methods and processes that you've put in place internally, and it's not something that you've passed on to someone. It's not something you've given away your secret on. So when the client comes to you, we can claim costs on their side from staff salaries, what they've paid you as a subcontractor, but then we can also look at your side of the story and go, okay, well, actually, without this work that Graham's company has done, the client wouldn't have actually got to the stage of that too. So this part of the project, Graham's actually paid for X, Y, and Z expenses. So definitely, best case scenario, both of you get something. Hope that answers the question.
Great, sounds good. Thanks, you said.
Gosh, I'm trying to think what else. I mean, always clients want to know what they're going to get back. That's the first question. I suppose, I'll give a wee bit of advice on options in the market, because this isn't a sales pitch for CATAX. It's just me coming along to explain a wee bit about the legislation. When you're looking at making these claims, I would say the best option is to go with a specialist. They will charge a contingency basis, so a percentage at the end. There are also specialists that will charge you an upfront fee, maybe a few thousand, and then at the end they'll take a smaller percentage. I would always advise that you don't really look at that option too much, because if you pay me 5 grand at the very beginning, I don't really have an incentive to push and maximise your claim, because I've already got 5 grand out of it, so I'm fine. So I wouldn't really ever advise you go for that option, but it does exist on the marketplace. Another option is you do have the opportunity to submit claims yourself. You don't have to pay a specialist. You can go onto, some websites, and the fee can be very, very small. So you might get like 95% of the costs and only pay 5% to the company or the website. But the problem is you are fully responsible for creating that claim. Now, if you do anything untoward, or you come across as amateur, or you make a mistake, or you overclaim, you are putting yourself at a huge risk to HMRC investigating you or giving you an audit. And you just need to ask yourself, is it worth it, to pay the less fee and have the problems? But or you could be the complete opposite, where you're totally familiar with this, you've worked with a specialist for 10 years, and you think you would rather give this a crack yourself. Then you should have the experience now to understand what to put. And the third option is so there's specialists, there's do-it-yourself, and then there's work with your accountant. Now, again, like I was saying, accountants, the best case scenario for CATAX is actually to work with your accountant, because typically if they've not brought it to your attention so far, how many other clients do they work with? who might actually benefit as well. They might have clients in the software field, manufacturing field, engineering, construction, whatever. So, you know, we appreciate working with accountants because we know that they appreciate our input. But again, accountants, you know, some companies are absolutely fine to do these claims. Some of them have departments that, you know, all they do is R&D tax relief. So, you know, I would say again, just do your research, do your homework. But I would advise that this is it's a niche sector. You can get bombarded with people approaching you, and you can also get yourself into a bit of a twist on asking yourself, right, here's my project, here's what Karen said about innovation. I think this might be right, but maybe not. That's definitely not. You could get yourself into a bit of a head twist with it. So again, the best scenario is to set up a call, have a chat, an open chat about your projects. Again, like I mentioned in regards to time, if you've got the time to look into it, then there's no rush for you to do this. But if you do have an April or a May year end, I would absolutely, you know, make that call a bit of a priority.
That's great. Thanks very much, Karen. And thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informed and some really good questions and discussions at the end there as well.
Superb. Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for staying. Normally at the end, it's like goes down to 2 at the end. Please, everyone, feel free as well to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect. And yeah, Victoria, once she sends around the presentation, my detail will be on there.
Yeah, no problem. And just a quick kind of finishing note from myself and the GIA. Our next event that will be coming up is the AGM, which is next week on the 15th of April at 6 p.m. And that will be followed by our annual lecture, where we'll be joined by Peter Clegg. All the information on that event is on our website, gia.org.uk, and that's also where you'll be able to find our recording for today's session. So thanks, everyone, and thanks, Karen.
Cheerio.
Thanks, Karen. Bye.
No worries. Bye-bye.